For nearly 3 centuries, naval warfare in the Western world was dominated by capital sailing ships. From the 17th century onward, they usually fought in a single long line, the line of battle, which allowed them to fire thunderous broadsides at the enemy fleet. Ships chosen for this demanding task, only the very best, were called ships of the line. In this video, we look at how modern historiography explains the evolution of the unstable, sluggish sailing ships of the Middle Ages to the massive, cannon-laden and maneuverable ships of the line that dominated the seas in the 17th and 18th centuries. Until the 17th century, the basic procedure that characterized naval warfare was to approach enemy ships, to weaken them and then go into melee in order to board them. Over time, sailors and strategists developed a vast variety of tactics, but the basic approach remained the same. After the 12th century, medieval ships slowly evolved to fit this procedure. Sailing ships of the time were built high and had powerful superstructures at the stern and bow, so-called castles. These castles served as fighting platforms and were very useful in close combat because they gave the crew the advantage of height. Sailing ships soon had an advantage over galleys, which used to be the main type of warship, especially in the Mediterranean. This advantage, however, was neutralized to some extent when ships began using heavy artillery from the 14th century onward. The high but relatively unstable sailing ships were much less suitable to carry heavy cannons than the relatively flat galleys with their low center of gravity. Subsequently, the heavily armed galley, able to damage sailing ships from afar, had a revival in the 16th century. The sailing ships briefly became less important. Check out our other video on naval warfare for more about that. According to the expert on naval warfare Louis Sicking, the sailing ship caught up slowly but steadily. Beginning in the 15th century, shipbuilders, first in Spain and Portugal, built ships with a more rigid structure. They built their vessel around a complete skeleton with braces and ribs, and fitted the planks carvel style, that is, without any overlap, unlike, for example, Viking ships. This construction method made it possible to build much more stable and robust ships, which could support more masts with a more complex rigging and much more sails. The result of these developments was the full-rigged ship, with at least 3 masts, which, according to the military historian Geoffrey Parker, had become the most important sailing ship in Europe by 1500. Its great hold served the needs of the growing European economy. Its superb sailing qualities facilitated voyages of discovery and overseas colonization. Its powerful construction was crucially capable to carry guns without taking damage or losing balance. Such a ship couldn't carry guns as massive as a galleys, but a handful of lighter shipboard guns were no problem. When gun ports came along around 1500 and guns could thus be placed closer to the waterline, sailing ships could be armed even better. This paved the way for the most famous firing mode in naval history, the broadside. One of the first ships capable of firing a broadside was the Great Michael, launched in Scotland in 1511. She had 12 guns on each side, 2 large basilisks at the stern and 1 at the bow. The goal of this revolutionary 1,000-ton ship design was to carry a main armament of artillery. Soon, other ships that were able to fire broadsides were built. But it would still be quite a while before the technology really caught on in practice. At first, only a handful of ships were built in this style, and they served representative purposes just as much as being functional warships. Many of them were not sunk by the enemy, but were financially unsustainable, such as the Great Michael, whose upkeep consumed about 10% of the total Scottish state income. Others were simply unable to sail, such as the Grand Françoise of Francis I of France, which had a tennis court, a chapel, and a windmill on board, but could not leave the port because her draught was too deep. Then there were those that failed because of accidents, such as the famous Mary Rose, which sank in 1545. Because overloaded with guns and men, she swayed in the wind and was then flooded through the gun ports that had been left open. So, albeit the prerequisites for the broadside were in place, there were still problems with practical application. Low-lying gun ports evidently carried some risks, but they were a crucial improvement because they massively increased the chance of hitting the hull of an enemy ship. Still, a number of disadvantages were yet unaddressed. A sailing ship found it much harder to take aim, because it depended on the wind as opposed to a galley that could be stabilized by its oars. There was also a tactical difficulty. as most of the guns of a sailing ship were mounted on its side. It couldn't shoot forward very well. This was problematic because at the time, most of the fighting took place head-to-head or in pursuit, especially for galley fleets who usually fought in the line abreast, that is, side by side with their prows pointed at the enemy. So, sailing ships only had the poor options of either presenting their vulnerable side in order to shoot, or only fire handguns and small cannons from the bow. A first approach to this problem was the introduction of small guns like culverines to the lower levels of the rear castle. These could fire forward past the main mast. This improved the situation, but it didn't solve the problem. Because of this, shipwrights all over Europe began to experiment with new types of ships. In the first half of the 16th century, they created the galleass, a ship propelled by oar and sail, meant to combine the military advantage of the galley with the seaworthiness of sails. It could carry both heavy forward-facing guns on the prow and lighter shipboard guns on the broadside. This period also saw the creation of the galleon, which would be one of the most important types of ships deployed in naval warfare well into the 17th century. Like almost all sailing vessels of the Middle Ages and the early modern period, the galleon was neither purely a warship nor purely a merchant vessel. With its great hold, fine sailing abilities, and battleworthiness, it fitted the needs of the time perfectly because it was common practice in Europe to temporarily convert merchant ships into warships when necessary, until at least the middle of the 17th century. For this purpose, suiting vessels were fitted with gun ports and castles, and hulls and masts were reinforced. This practice made it possible to draw on a reserve of ships in case of emergency without having to maintain an expensive war fleet that was of little use in peacetime. This is not to say that rulers or countries could not maintain a war fleet, but even these ships were often suitable for trade and war. Since the middle of the 16th century, gunpowder artillery had become the main weapon on sailing ships, and shooting at the enemy from afar replaced boarding as the core element of naval warfare. This process was extremely slow, but it eventually led to a reduction of sailing ships as castles and to their hulls being built shallower and sturdier so they could accommodate more guns. Depending on their size, sailing ships had now 1, 2, or in exceptional cases 3 complete battery decks and guns at the bow and stern, including so-called chasers, used to slow down the enemy ship in a pursuit. To cope with this amount of artillery, the ship's form had to be adapted as well. The English took the lead by designing ships that were faster, more maneuverable, and more heavily armed. Representative of this new generation of warships is the famous dreadnought, a race-built galleon launched in 1573. This ship was built to sink enemy vessels from a distance with its tremendous broadsides, and, in contrast to the ponderous giants mentioned earlier, was actually able to do the job. While Spain and Portugal were the dominant naval powers at the beginning of the century, England had been catching up in leaps and bounds since about 1550. This became evident in 1588 when the English fleet repelled the Spanish armada sent by Philip II to invade England and defeated it in several battles. According to Geoffrey Parker, England had thus overtaken the southern kingdoms as the leading naval power of Europe. Spain's defeat had consequences for all of Europe. Philip II reformed his navy and built a new overseas fleet to restore Spain's position as the dominant naval power, but it was too late. Others were now also building their own modern fleets. A naval arms race had begun. Right at the forefront were the Dutch, who built a huge fleet of merchant vessels in a very short time. As explained earlier, this gave them a large reservoir to draw on for martial purposes as well. By the end of the century, the Dutch could not only keep up with the war fleets of England, France, and Spain, but even had a surplus of ships which they could rent out to other powers. In the wake of this arms race, new types of ships, designed with a stronger emphasis on martial purposes, most famously the frigate, which, according to the historian Robert Stradling, was, quote, the first generation of specialist fighting ships in the West outside the Mediterranean, end quote. All Atlantic powers now began to build superclass ships. Ships like the Prince Royal, built in England in 1610, were no longer simply armed sailing vessels. They were larger than most English country houses, and armed with more artillery than many fortresses. Yet, large parts of this artillery, namely the broadside cannons, were not used to their full potential. because it was still common to approach the enemy prow-forward. This confined sailing ships to their chasing guns, while the capacity of broadsides remained largely unexploited. In the first half of the 17th century, the admirals of Europe began to experiment with new tactics, especially in England and the Dutch Republic. They explored ways of using the broadside efficiently and finally found a tactic that had been used infrequently since about 1500, the so-called line of battle, or line ahead. Contrary to the earlier so-called line abreast, where the ships were drawn up side by side, the ships now sailed past the enemy at a 90-degree angle, in one single line, one behind the other, and could thus make optimal use of their broadsides. All maneuvers were executed in a line, so that ships could cover each other ideally. This new tactic had several advantages over the rather chaotic single combat practiced hitherto. Because the ships moved in an order, all of them had a clear field of fire and the risk of friendly fire dwindled. This allowed them to shoot faster and more often. Moreover, moving past the enemy allowed several ships to concentrate their fire on one target, unless the enemy fought in a line of battle as well. One of the first detailed instructions on this was written in 1653 by the English Admiral Robert Blake, while his fleet was fighting the Dutch Republic in the Anglo-Dutch Wars. According to Blake, the English first used the line ahead as a standard tactic, and had great success with it. When the Dutch copied it, the battle saw two seemingly endless lines of ships, according to Geoffrey Parker sometimes more than 5 kilometers long, locked in a deadly artillery duel that lasted until one side retreated. In the Battle of Texel in 1673, for example, 75 Dutch ships faced 104 English ships, a total of 9,000 to 10,000 guns. These ships were virtually stuffed with cannons, but their broadsides rarely sank enemy ships. The largest guns fired from such a capital sailing ship were usually 32-pounders. Just to give you some context, a galley had up to 120-pounders at the bow. Although they could pierce the hull of a ship quite easily and posed a deadly threat to anyone in and on the ship, the structural integrity of the ship was hardly ever at risk. It was much more common that ships would surrender because they were unable to maneuver due to, for example, a broken mast, a fire, or high casualties. Ships were rarely sunk. Nevertheless, the efficiency of the new tactic impressed admirals of Europe, and gradually all European naval powers adopted the line of battle. In order to avoid weak spots, only the best and strongest ships were selected to fight in the line. These became known as ships of the line. The battles of the English-Dutch Wars not only showed that the future belonged to the line of battle, but also that converted merchant ships were inferior to ships built solely for the purposes of fighting. The new tactic favored very large and stable ships that carried a lot of artillery and held their ground in the face of heavy fire. As a result, merchant vessels gradually lost their military importance. The first large standing war fleets emerged, and the naval powers of Europe began to build ships specifically suited for single-line combat. Nevertheless, the ships of the line were far from standardized and, according to Stradling, differed, quote, from country to country, from shipyard to shipyard, and even from ship to ship, end quote. In the 17th century, most ships of the line had 2 or 3 decks equipped with a total of 50 to 100 cannons, those carrying 90 to 100 being very rare. Soon, technological improvements such as lighter guns and better rigging made it possible to build even larger ships. In the 18th century, a first-rate ship of the line carried at least 100 guns. A ship with 50 guns was usually already considered too small for the line of battle. The 18th century also saw a certain degree of standardization. From the 1730s onward, the 74, a 2-decked ship which combined good sailing capabilities with great firepower, became the most common ship of the line. Now the average fleet consisted of a first-rate flagship, 10 to 25 smaller ships of the line, and some auxiliaries. Such fleets came to dominate the waters of the world until well into the 19th century, when they were gradually replaced by the steam-powered ironclad, the forerunner of the modern battleship.